In our neighborhood, homeless people have recently started appearing, an all too common sight in many American cities. They've taken to spending their days in the old playground, drinking heavily, cursing, and occasionally fighting. Our area isn't busy. There are hardly any kids around, and the playground equipment has rusted and become an eyesore, much like the homeless who drink there daily. They didn't cause trouble, disappearing somewhere at night. There were always four of them, 3 men and 1 woman shivering from the cold. Nobody planned to chase them away. People just complained about them and then went back to their homes. I'll talk more about these homeless folks later, but first, let me tell you a bit about myself and where I live for context. My name is John. I live in a building that was constructed during the post-war housing boom. It's basically a boarding house now. I live, work, and relax here, temporarily on my own since my mom passed away a few months ago. My room is small, but it's enough. The only downside is the shared bathroom, although there aren't many people living in our building. There are probably about 10 empty rooms. I've shared all this to help you understand what started happening next. It all began on a Friday, I think. I got home from work around 7 p.m., looking forward to the weekend. That unfortunate evening marked the start of a series of terrifying events in our home and yard. Exhausted, I came back to find only some mac and cheese and a piece of leftover chicken in the fridge. With no energy or desire to cook, I ate what was there. As the saying goes, after a hearty meal, one should have a smoke. I took a cigarette from the pack, lit it, and opened the window, which looked out over the yard. It was already dark outside, and the street lights weren't working, so only the silhouettes of the broken, rusty swings and the rocket-shaped slide were visible. While smoking, I heard a distant conversation somewhere in the yard. They were mumbling something, trying to keep it quiet but not doing a great job, and from the hoarse, ragged voices, I realized it was those same homeless people I mentioned earlier. I thought it was weird that they were still there. Usually they would have left by that time. They were yelling at each other, and frustratingly, I couldn't understand a word. It was in some language of their own, I guess. Maybe they hadn't finished their drink yet, which is why they were still around. With the window closed, I couldn't hear them. I finished my cigarette, put it out, and went to bed, falling asleep right away. I didn't wake up during the night and had no dreams. I woke up around 10 a.m., earlier than my alarm. The first order of business, naturally, was coffee and a cigarette. I made some coffee and opened the window again. Living on the second floor, the smell of the coffee filled the room as the foam rose, and I turned off the stove, lit another cigarette, and leaned out the window. To my surprise, I heard the same chatter from the yard as the night before, and saw the same homeless people on the playground. Had they been there all night? It amazed me how deeply people could sink their lives. To each their own, I figured everyone makes their own choices. As I thought about this, my cigarette burned down to the filter and burned my finger, causing me to drop it. Right after, something interesting happened. One of the homeless men ran toward my building, quickly and seriously, surprisingly agile for his apparent age. He grabbed the still smoking butt, tried to relight it, then looked up at me and shouted, "Hey buddy, I really need a smoke. I'd sell my soul to the devil for one. Can you toss me a cigarette?" I figured it wouldn't hurt me, so I threw one down from the balcony. He calmly picked it up, struck a match from his pocket, lit the cigarette, nodded at me, and walked back to his group. After closing the window, I thought about the situation. The playground was close to the building, but they were sitting at its farthest corner, near the swings, about 500 feet away. Plus, a tree in front of the building, though leafless, still blocked the view somewhat. How did he notice me drop the cigarette so quickly? At that moment, I chalked it up to the homeless man's surprisingly good eyesight. Today I was supposed to meet a friend to drink some beer at his place. We agreed I'd come over around 4 o'clock. Until then, I stayed home and browsed the internet, and also went out to buy some food. Time flew by quickly, and I left the house around 3 o'clock. To avoid walking around the entire yard, I decided to cut through the playground. And, of course, the homeless people were there. Specifically, the one who had asked for a cigarette that morning. What do you think he wanted? The same thing as in the morning. He approached me and said, "Don't think me forward, but could I trouble you for another cigarette?" I thought, why not? Though the smell of him was unbearable, a strange mix of rotting meat, alcohol, and tobacco. Nevertheless, I gave him a cigarette and walked on. He grabbed my shoulder firmly as I turned to leave. "Man, what are you doing?" I exclaimed. He let go and stared at me. "What else do you want?" I asked, glancing at his companions, who were staring at me as if I were some kind of alien. "Sorry to ask, but what's your name?" he whispered. "John," I replied. "Listen, John, you're a good man, thanks. Can you spare $10 for a drink? I asked your neighbor, the bald guy downstairs, but he told me to get lost. Help me out, even though I only have plastic on me and no cash for the bus fare." With a disapproving look, he watched me light a match, smoke, and walk away. I headed to the bus stop, thinking there was no point in telling about how we drank beer and played cards with my friend, but the events of my return home that evening are worth mentioning. I took an Uber home, which stopped near the first entrance, although I needed the second. But an ambulance and a police car were parked there. In the darkness, I couldn't tell what type of vehicle it was until it flashed its lights and I let the Uber go. I walked to my entrance where people were gathered and the police were examining something. It was between 11 and midnight. "What happened here?" I asked the police. But the answer revealed itself as the paramedics wheeled out my neighbor, Uncle Bob, on a stretcher, apparently dead, sand spilling from his mouth. His stomach had been stuffed with sand, and the familiar odor of rotting meat wafted from him. Then it all clicked in my mind. When I had gone to my friend's place, the homeless man told me that my neighbor had withheld money from him and sent him packing. The sand must have come from the playground. No need for a psychic there. I was terrified. There was no trace of alcohol left in my system. Climbing the stairs, I pondered all these thoughts, remembering that I too had refused to give him money. Could the homeless have killed my neighbor? Rushing into my apartment, I locked the door and stared out the window. The yard was silent except for the occasional barking of our neighborhood dogs. I stood there for about 20 minutes, then went to take a shower, haunted by thoughts of the homeless, my neighbor with sand in his mouth, and the evening's chaos. I felt very uneasy, but the worst was yet to come. Standing under the warm shower, I had no idea what I was about to endure. After bathing, I walked down the hallway, listening to every damn sound. As I entered my home and peeked out the window, they were there again, and I felt someone's gaze drilling into me, as if one of them was watching me. Even in the darkness, I could see that they were up to something on the playground. Just in case, I stepped out of my room and turned on the lights at the entrance to see better. But as soon as I did, their movement stopped. I didn't like it one bit. I didn't wait. I called 911 and asked them to come to my address. I watched from the window, waiting for the police, when I saw the headlights from around the corner. But as soon as they approached, something happened that will probably haunt me in my worst nightmares. As the police car advanced, the homeless also moved closer, as if they knew they were being followed, but were not heading towards the officers. They were fleeing from them like any sane person. The police stopped, got out, and approached them. That's when one of the homeless women attacked one of the officers with a terrifying, inhuman roar. Before another officer could react, one of the homeless men swiftly moved his hand from below, whether with a knife or something else, I couldn't tell. But I saw it clearly in the light from the entrance lamps. It almost made me sick. Then they began to eat them. I was petrified with horror, watching them tear off the officers' limbs with ease as if ripping paper. They sat gnawing on the bones, pulling organs from the torn bellies, trying to chew on them. Frozen with fear, I couldn't move. I was afraid any slight motion might draw their attention. Then, I cautiously sat down at the level of the windowsill and peeked out just enough to see one of them dragging the remains of the officers towards the sandbox, and starting to do something with them, probably burying. I considered calling 911 again, but just as I dialed, I heard a harsh, frightening voice from the yard. "Who are you calling, brother?" Frozen with fear, I was overcome with nausea and a stabbing pain in my stomach. I cautiously looked out the window again. They were standing right at the entrance, drenched in blood, and there was something else off about them. Their eyes seemed to glow with visible yellow points, and the woman, who was growling like some demon, held a policeman's cap, which soon flew towards my window. The glass shattered, and these creatures began laughing, a laugh so devilish it seemed as if demons had crawled out from hell itself. This wasn't human. I was convinced of this as they climbed up the wall towards my window. At first I didn't understand, but when a grotesque head with glowing eyes and peeling skin appeared over the windowsill, I listened, panicked, and fled into the boarding house corridor, knocking on neighbors' doors. Through my own door, I could hear them enter my room. Fortunately, my door was a sturdy metal one. They banged on it a couple of times from the inside and then quieted down. Finally, I got through to my neighbor Mike, who let me in. He's handy with tools. We called 911, and they arrived within 10 minutes. By then, there were no homeless people in my apartment or on the street, just huge puddles of blood in the yard and gnawed remains of the police officers buried in the children's sandbox. Oh, and one of their heads was in my room. After a long ordeal of police examinations and inquiries, the case was eventually dropped and I was released. I had told them everything, but of course nobody believed me since there were no proofs or clues pointing to me, so they let me go. The detective was decent, seeing that I was a normal, law-abiding guy who couldn't have done such a thing. Later, Uncle Mike shocked me when I visited him for a bottle of good whiskey. He told me about the homeless people. Apparently, about 20 years ago, they lived here. Good-hearted homeless folks who indeed drank heavily but always helped out, doing odd jobs, taking out trash, or helping in the community garden. They were always generous, giving whatever they could, sometimes money, sometimes just thanks. But then winter came, around 1995, and they began to starve and freeze. You know how tough those times were. They started to eat each other, and no one even brought them a piece of bread, let alone any warm clothing. They were driven from the building entrances and eventually died from hunger and cold. Since then, people have occasionally seen them, all of them bitter towards everyone, and the police got it too because they used to beat them with batons for fun. So they take revenge on everyone indiscriminately. As for me, they definitely had their eye on me. If I didn't want to encounter them again, I should go buy a couple of bottles and some bread with cold cuts, write down from whom and the apartment number for good measure, and everything would be fine. I did just that the next day. Since then, I haven't seen or heard them, but the bread and whiskey disappeared, even though there was no one in the yard. The sense of relief was fleeting, lasting only as long as it took for the wind to change direction, bringing with it the stench of old fears and memories. The quiet of the night could no longer assure me of safety. It now whispered of lurking horrors and unquiet spirits. The old playground, once a symbol of joyful abandon, had transformed into a stage for ghastly reenactments of past tragedies. The next few nights passed in an uneasy silence. I often found myself staring out the window, half expecting to see those unsettling figures emerge from the shadows. The yard remained deserted, however, except for the occasional stray cat or rustling leaves. Despite the quiet, the echo of their last visit haunted me, a grim reminder that the barrier between their world and mine was perhaps thinner than I cared to admit. During the day, I tried to keep busy, to drown out the creeping dread with mundane routines. I focused on work, on the hum of the city around me, and on casual conversations with neighbors who, unaware of my nocturnal visitors, complained about more prosaic disturbances, traffic, weather, the unreliability of the city's services. One evening, about a week after the incident, I was returning from a late shift. The street was poorly lit, shrouded in mist that seemed to swallow the weak beams of the street lamps. As I approached the building, I noticed something unusual, a faint glow coming from the playground. My first thought was of street kids messing around, perhaps lighting fires. But as I got closer, the glow resolved itself into several small, steady lights hovering just above the ground. Curiosity overcame my fear, and I edged closer, keeping to the shadows. The lights were candles, set in a rough circle on the ground, flickering in the gentle breeze. And there, sitting quietly around the circle, were the homeless individuals I had come to dread. But they were different now, subdued, their faces somber, their eyes downcast. In the center of the circle was a collection of small makeshift memorials, photos faded by time, trinkets, and handwritten notes protected by plastic sheets. I watched, hidden by darkness, as they spoke in turn. Their voices were soft, filled with a sorrow that was palpable. They spoke of memories, of regrets, of apologies never given. It was a vigil, a moment of collective mourning for lives that had spiraled into despair, for friends long gone, and perhaps for themselves. As they concluded, one of the men, the same who had previously run up for a cigarette, stood and looked directly toward where I was hidden. I tensed, ready to flee, but his voice was calm, his demeanor peaceful. "Whoever's out there, know this," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the quiet night. "We're not your enemies. We never wanted to frighten anyone. We just got lost along the way. Lost in memories, in pain, in a world that moved on without us." With that, he turned back to the group, and they slowly began to disperse, leaving the candles burning in the soft night air. I remained hidden until the last of them had vanished into the darkness, and then I approached the circle of candles. Each flicker seemed to tell a story of hardship and endurance, of lives too often overlooked. Moved by the ceremony and their words, I made a decision. The next day, I gathered food, clothes, and a few old blankets. I left them near the playground with a note, "For those who feel forgotten," from a neighbor. Since that night, the spirits, or perhaps they were just people after all, haven't returned. Maybe they found some peace, or maybe they simply moved on. But every so often I replace the candles and sit for a while, thinking about the thin lines between past and present, between ghost stories and the very real stories of those who walk among us, unseen. In sharing their sorrow, I had unwittingly stepped into a role I never expected, to bear witness, to remember, and perhaps to start healing the wounds of a community too long ignored. It was a small gesture, but sometimes small gestures are all we have.